Welcome to First and Future Live, a new program from the Institute for Emerging Issues at NC State University. I'm Leslie Boney, the director of the Institute, and this program is a place where we want to hear from people who are shaping our state's future on a variety of topics. In the coming weeks and months, we're going to focus on some of the most important topics that we as a state are facing, including the future of higher education, recovery from learning loss, the pandemic, the economy, and others. And we're doing it live. Some of you are tuning in via our YouTube channel, others on Facebook Live. We ask that you listen to what our guests are talking about, then prepare your questions for them, put them in chat, and you will get as many of them as possible answered. If you like the show, please tell your friends about it. But we want this to be a forum where you learn something, but you also share something of what you know. So if we don't get it right, tell us. If we do get it right, tell us that too. We're going to be on every other week on Tuesday mornings. We wanted to start this new program by talking about one of the biggest issues facing our state right now and the nation, honestly. How do we get policing and our court systems to work more effectively in the future, so that systems work better for everyone, regardless of race? Our guests this morning are representatives of two different groups who've been looking at reforms to make our systems work better. First, the co-chairs of a task force appointed by the governor, the Task Force on Racial Equity in Criminal Justice, Associate Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls, and North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein. We're also joined by the co-chair of the House Select Committee on Community Relations, Law Enforcement, and Justice, Representative John Szoka. Thanks to you all for being with us. Let me just start with a brief overview of some of the data, and these are data that came out during the work of the task force. If you look at national data, you see when it comes to arrests, Blacks are twice as likely to be pulled over for a traffic stop. In terms of death, Black men are twice as likely to be killed by law enforcement compared to white men. Black women, 1.4 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than white women. Still looking at national data, if you look at sentencing, Blacks are more likely to receive longer sentences than whites. And that is for the same crime, and also when it comes to life without parole. If you look at imprisonment rates, Blacks are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Latinos, a little more than 3 times as likely. And Black women, more likely to be incarcerated than white women. If you look at North Carolina data, the way that translates into prison population is that Blacks make up about 22% of our population and comprise about 50% of our prison population. So it's clear that disparities exist, and in their report, the task force referred to these disparities as grotesque. The question is, what can be done? Both these groups that we're talking with today have issued reports looking at that question. If you have questions about either report or ideas about what needs to happen to increase or improve equal treatment under the law, or how to increase or improve public safety, please send us your questions. I'm going to start with the work of the task force, which was monumental. Justice Earls, the task force issued a total of 125 suggested changes in 7 different categories, ranging from how to improve working with folks who have mental health conditions, to increasing community policing, increasing transparency and accountability and reporting of policing, changing the way we recruit police officers, the way we handle pretrial release and bail, the way we pick juries and sentencing. How did you determine, based on everything you heard, what made the list and what didn't?
So this was a very collaborative process. The governor appointed 24 members of the task force representing a broad base of stakeholders. So we had local elected officials, legislators, sheriffs, police chiefs, community members, representatives of various communities, and directly impacted individuals. So really a wide range of stakeholders to come together and look at the executive order tasked us with having evidence-based solutions. So we had to look at what does the evidence show about what is causing these racial disparities and what is effective in helping them no longer result from our practices and policies. So it was a process of learning, discussing amongst ourselves. There were some recommendations that were more controversial than others, but then all of this was public. It was all done virtually, but it's all public and recorded and available on the website for the task force. We voted ultimately, and most of the recommendations were fairly unanimous. Some were close votes, and some were compromises. I was most struck by how people came to this work with an open mind and honestly said, I've changed my view about this. Now that I've heard about this, I think this way. Or now that I've heard from this person who hadn't explained the law enforcement perspective to me before, now I have a different view. So the real work over the next 2 years for the task force is implementing these recommendations.
Attorney General Stein, you're on some level recognized as the top cop in the state. What did you hear about training and charging that surprised you, that made it into the report? I think you're muted.
Unfortunately, I said the most profound thing I will say all day, and it was lost to the ether. What sparked this whole effort was the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And it was that moment, that interaction between law enforcement and the citizen, where it had its most tragic outcome. But when the governor asked us to do this work, he said, obviously, I care about that interaction, but there's a lot of the criminal justice system that happens before those two people ever met. And there's a lot to the criminal justice system that happens after that fact. And so we had a very holistic view of both how do we improve law enforcement in North Carolina, and how do we deal with the criminal justice, the laws that we have, the court system, incarceration, post-release. We went through the whole process. As it related to the topics you mentioned, we want to recruit the best people into law enforcement possible, the people who come at it with the right orientation, that of trying to serve and protect their community, and as opposed to the person who wants to just barge down the door. We want to make sure that those people are exceptionally well trained in implicit bias, in ethics, in de-escalation techniques, in crisis intervention training. So many interactions that go south are where somebody may have a mental health or a drug issue, and law enforcement isn't properly trained as to how to create, to take the heat out of that situation. And so training them in that. But then we also want to have all these policing practice improvements. And it is very important that we have accountability on the back end. We want to have early intervention systems where when officers fail to live up to the policies that their departments have, that they get corrected quickly and effectively. And to the extent people cannot be changed, they need to find another line of work where they don't have a gun and they don't have a badge and they don't have control over the citizenry. And so making sure that people who shouldn't be law enforcement find another occupation. We have to make sure that that list is comprehensive, and then an officer can't leave one department and then go to another office 3 counties over. There has to make sure that we don't have this wandering officer problem. So basically, there's a lot that we have to do to raise the bar of law enforcement. It is an exceptionally challenging job, one of the most challenging that exists. And we have to do everything we can to support the officers who are out there, the vast majority of whom are wonderful people who really are service oriented. But we have to make sure that we're responding to public safety issues in an appropriate way.
Representative Szoka, a lot of the issues that both Justice Earls and General Stein have brought up are covered by the similar report that was developed kind of on a parallel track by the House Select Committee. 32 members, most of them from the House, but also including judges, law enforcement, DAs, local elected officials, 5 meetings, 13 recommendations. So a boiled down list of recommendations, but a huge undertaking that you took on while also trying to run for re-election. Why did you decide to take on this work? Why was it important to you?
Well, it was important to me because, like I've told other folks, whenever there's demonstrations in the streets, no matter how it turns out, the peaceful demonstrations, and then sometimes they turn violent, at the core of every public demonstration, there's some core issue that people are concerned about. And obviously what started the protests across the state and across the nation was the killing of George Floyd. And the core issue there, the question that I asked was, in North Carolina, do we have a law that would prohibit and punish a law enforcement officer from doing what was reportedly done to George Floyd? And the answer was not really. So I don't want that happening in our state. So the purpose of with a reduced scope, that we didn't have near as many meetings as you pointed out, was to get to a number of actionable items that we could put our hands around and actually get some legislation moving this year to make a concrete difference, to show the folks across our state and across the nation that A, we understand what you're concerned about, and B, we're actually trying to do something about it. So that's why we only had about 13. And as you pointed out, we were running for re-election at the same time as well. So we didn't have the opportunity to have as many meetings as the other group did. I think we were able to narrow it down sufficiently to get a number of actionable items. Right now, I'm in the process of bill drafting for a couple of them to try and get them entered and move them through the legislative process.
I looked through all the recommendations of the task force and the select committee and did sort of a comparison side by side with some help from Simone Coleman on our staff. And 67 out of the 125 recommendations require on some level legislative action. And there really did seem to be some overlap when it came to mental health challenges, the importance that General Stein mentioned of helping to train people to deal with those who may present themselves to them with mental health challenges. Some changes, or at least an endorsement of the importance of looking at adjusting how law enforcement training happens. Seemed to be consistency on reducing the use of chokeholds, and at least an openness to reclassification of some of the lower level offenses. Realizing that there were differences in the nuance of how you presented those recommendations. We go first maybe to Representative Szoka about which ones he thinks are going to move, and then to General Stein and Justice Earls for which ones they hope will move this session.
Well, I would hope that we have legislation for all 13. Different members, both parties are working on different things. One thing that I'm working on is the chokehold issue and the duty to intervene, because I feel that these two are inextricably intertwined. If someone, I go back to my military days. I'm a retired Army officer. The United States is a signer to the Geneva Convention. One of the things that everyone in the Army understands is that you have a duty to intervene if you see a fellow soldier, officer, whether they outrank you or not, doing something that's against the Geneva Convention. For example, if you have a prisoner of war and someone's just going to shoot him, you have a duty to intervene, or you're just as guilty as the person who perhaps could shoot and kill that person. Taking that same logic, I think that there's perhaps sometimes a hesitancy in the superior-subordinate relationship, and not just in law enforcement, but you see in corporate business and everything else. When you see someone doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and there's a hesitancy to intervene. So I think that what the answer to that is clearly to make it a legal responsibility for someone to intervene when you see someone doing something that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, I can't help but believe that the other officers witnessing George Floyd's killing knew that what was happening was wrong. I mean, I just, and you have to counter that, then the duty to intervene with what the police and the sheriffs and even the PBA and the FOP says, that a lot of times in these some-on-one or one-on-one encounters, that it's very difficult to figure out what actually is going on. So parsing the language to protect both the accused or perpetrator or someone who they think might be doing something wrong, and to protect the law enforcement officers at the same time is a difficult thing. One of the examples that somebody gave me on chokeholds, which there are legal chokehold covers a wide range of things. It actually has a very definite name for what is taught. There are things that are illegal to do, and there are things that right now you can do. And once the person stops struggling, you're supposed to stop, or you can have adverse actions up to and including death. So an example of that is you have a 130-pound female officer who is on her own and somehow comes into contact with a suspect, either whatever the case may be, who might be high on drugs and is fighting her, been disarmed, can't get to her taser, can't get to her gun, can't get to anything else, and it's a one-on-one struggle. Are we going to tell that person that she can't defend her own life by using some type of hold on the accused? Well, we're not going to do that, because that would not obviously be the right thing to do. So the difficulty is in this issue, as in most legislative issues, is finding out the right balance between both sides so that law enforcement officers are protected, the accused is protected from some fatal encounter, and putting it into law, which is then enforceable. So with the duty to intervene, we are currently working on that language. I think we have some language almost ready to go. And then the other part of that is you have to have some type of legislation to follow that up, that you can't retaliate against a law enforcement officer from reporting what he or she sees and believes to be illegal over an excessive use of force. You can't have a retaliatory situation, because then there's no motivation for someone to report it. So you have to come up with a system on how do you report it, how do you protect the law enforcement officer who sees it, given due process to the, in this case, accused law enforcement officer who may or may not have done something wrong. And you mix all that up into the, it happens at night and everything else. So what really appears to be a simple issue becomes very complex, because we not only need to protect the public from illegal or bad consequences of things that law enforcement officers might do, but we need to protect our law enforcement officers from claims and the uncertainty. You don't want to handcuff them literally, that they can't do their job in protecting the public. So we had those two things that go together, working on a bill. And as you might suspect, as I've kind of laid it out, it does take a lot of back and forth between different organizations trying to find that delicate balance where the public is protected, the law enforcement is protected, and there's a law that's actually enforceable that we can pass and get everybody to agree on in both chambers and the governor to sign. So that's the first thing, and then we can. Sorry it took so long to explain that, but I think it really goes on to each and every one of these issues that, while some things seem easy, perhaps to the public, they get complex because you have the public safety issue, and you also have to protect the officers' rights. And the other two folks on the call are they're both attorneys, so they understand it much better than I. But hopefully I described it properly.
Yeah, General Stein, let me ask you about that balance that Representative Szoka is talking about. How do you find that balance between, obviously you want law enforcement officers to have the ability to do their job safely, but you also want to have the public protected from their sometimes overzealousness or other things. How did you strike that balance in your report?
Well, as related to the specific issue of chokeholds, we say chokeholds are banned unless it's necessary to protect the life of the officer. I mean, obviously when we hire a person to go out there and keep us safe, it is incumbent upon us to do everything we can to support and protect that officer, because it's a dangerous job. Just like Representative Szoka says, there are times where the officer is physically outmatched by whoever they're trying to detain. And if something were to happen and it becomes the life of the officer or the person who is trying to be detained because they're in this fight that escalated because of the person who's trying to be detained, the officer has a responsibility to do whatever it takes to stay alive. And so you just put that word in there. I don't think it's particularly that complicated in my view. One thing I want to say, Leslie, in terms of where we hope the legislature goes, because a lot of our recommendations are legislative oriented, not all of them. Some of them can be implemented by the courts, some by state agencies, others by local law enforcement offices. But a lot of them do require a change in statute. And what we have right here is Representative Szoka is a Republican and I'm a Democrat. We've got the legislative branch, the executive, and Justice Earls from the judiciary. This is an issue that really unites all of us. And criminal justice reform has been in recent years one of the rare issues, sadly, one of the rare issues where the parties have been able to work together. And I compliment a number of the laws that the Republican-led legislature has passed in recent years. They did a whole review of sentencing in like 2011. Representative Geis took that on. They've raised the age of juvenile jurisdiction. They've passed laws to make expunction easier so people can have a second chance. They've done a lot of positive things. And I think this whole effort is trying to take that and take it to a different level, to take it to a more comprehensive place where we're attacking a whole host of issues that need to be changed for our criminal justice system to live up to the ideal that we have chiseled into the face of the United States Supreme Court building, which are equal justice under law. I know Representative Szoka is on a bill in the House that would raise the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction from 6 to 10. We're the only state in the country, I think we're the only democracy in the Western world, where a 6-year-old can be pulled into juvenile court for some violation. And there was a compelling story written in the News and Observer last week about literally a 6-year-old child at a school bus stop picking a tulip from someone's house, getting arrested and brought into juvenile. I mean, it defies common sense. So that's one idea. Senators Britt, Daniel, and Lee introduced a bill yesterday, SB 300, that has a lot of really strong provisions about recruitment, about training, about accountability of law enforcement, changes to the bail system, making sure that right now, if you get arrested for a felony, you have your first appearance where you're considered for bail within 48 hours. If you're arrested for a misdemeanor, there's no requirement that you have that first appearance. There are people in North Carolina jails today who were arrested for a misdemeanor, who can't afford the $500 bail and are there for a period of time longer than had they been convicted of the charge for which they are arrested. So there are just some fundamental problems with our criminal justice system we have to fix. And what I'm encouraged about is that not only did Representative Szoka lead his committee to come up with a number of recommendations, there's interest in the Senate and a lot of ideas, but the Conference of District Attorneys, the Sheriff's Association, the Chiefs of Police, they have all put forward their own list of desired reforms. And it's through our working together, I think we can really make a difference in a dramatic improvement to our criminal justice system.
Let me ask about one of the areas where there might be some disagreement, although it's mentioned in both reports, and that is the decriminalization of some lower level traffic and marijuana charges. The task force included that among their recommendations, and I'm wondering maybe Justice Earls, if you could talk about either that or cash bail, both of which have a disproportionate effect on people heading into prison.
Both of those recommendations, in a lot of ways, were driven by the data about who gets into the criminal justice system in the first place. And so we certainly took a very broad approach looking at what makes our community safe how do we, promote public safety? We had victims' rights organization representatives on our commission, and victims spoke to us. And I do think that keeping people out of the criminal justice system at the outset is part of contributing to ultimately keeping our community safe. And so the issue of decriminalizing marijuana, when you look at the numbers of people who are arrested for possessing less than a half an ounce of marijuana, it's a lot of people who end up in the criminal justice system for that charge. And it's one of the ways that the racial disproportionality enters the system, because 61% of the people who are found guilty of that charge are people of color, and they are not disproportionately. The research tells us that blacks and whites use marijuana at roughly the same rates. So the racial disproportionality enters the system through those kinds of arrests, and that's one reason why there's that recommendation. On the issue of bail, that's one where I think a lot can be done even without a change in the law. So I really do want to emphasize the wide range of recommendations that we made that don't require legislative action. Our statute in North Carolina de-emphasizes cash bail. It's supposed to be a last resort. And this is where the local practice kind of frustrates what the actual statutory language is. And so some of this involves, I think, training and looking at other practices. There has been litigation over this as well. But what we certainly know from other states is that when bail is, so Illinois just eliminated bail altogether. New Jersey has also implemented reforms, and New Jersey's experience showed that they dramatically decreased the number of people in jail awaiting trials. They didn't end the racial disproportionality, so there's still more work to be done. But it's clear that you don't have to keep people in jail in order for them to ultimately come back to court and answer for the charges. And finally, if I can, just to comment, Attorney General Stein talked about the different groups that have met and made recommendations. There have also been a wide range of community-based efforts looking at what reforms should happen. Some of these community-based groups, reports, advocacy happened before the task force was even formed. So around bail, as well as around fines and fees, and around the issue of collateral consequences of convictions. So getting people expunctions and certificates of relief. Those are all the types of things where there have been community-based efforts looking at those policies and making recommendations, as well as police accountability and the issue of citizen review boards, and the whole question of the role of school resource officers. These are all issues where in different parts of the state, community groups have been meeting and saying what they think the policy should be. And that certainly was part of what our task force was able to look at and build on.
44 of the 125 recommendations call for some sort of local action, and that's where those community groups that are meeting are so important. You've talked a little bit about some of the issues that they're talking about. I'm wondering where you see things maybe getting energy on a community level, and how important is the community part of this work?
I think that it's critically important. So some of the places, I think, where we have some demonstration projects in some parts of the state, and the task is to figure out how that can be expanded to other parts of the state, and recognizing that what might work in Mecklenburg County may not work in Avery County. There's urban, rural differences in resources. But so some of the things I would point to is the creation of more pretrial diversion programs, including things like the school justice partnerships, where school officials and justice system representatives are working together to really interrupt what we call the school to prison pipeline and to keep juveniles out of the criminal justice system. So I think that's a whole range of programs that can be locally funded, have been shown to be really effective in some parts of the state, and we can expand them. I also think the restorative justice efforts, and we heard from a program in Wilmington, as well as some other parts of the state where there are efforts. Some of these are school-based, some of them are more broadly community-based, but efforts to look at what truly heals victims and communities when there is a crime, and are there alternatives to the adversarial nature of the criminal justice process that can actually make our communities safer. So those are some of the things I would point to that could really take off at the local level.
I have a question from one of our listeners who's asking about the relationship between no cash bail and violent crime rates. He's noting particularly Chicago and New York City violent crime rates. Is there evidence that shows that no cash bail has an impact one way or another on crime rates?
There's actually been a lot of work on this in North Carolina, where different prosecutorial districts have implemented different reforms, and the data is the two reasons why you would have cash bail, because Justice Earls articulates the statute that the General Assembly passed perfectly well. It says there shall be no financial conditions on release unless the person is a risk to hurt a witness, commit future crime, or fail to appear for court. So basically, will they do more crime or will they not show up for their trial date? And the reforms that have been implemented have showed that the people have not committed crimes when they're awaiting their trial date, and they are appearing for their trial date at the same rate as people who are detained. And so then you ask yourself, what's the value in depriving somebody of their liberty when they haven't even been convicted of the crime? And here's the sad truth. Studies have also shown that the longer you detain somebody before their trial, after they've been arrested, but they have not been convicted, innocent until proven guilty, the longer you detain them, the more likely it is they will commit crimes in the future. So if the theory is that we're actually locking people up before their trial to keep the public safe, it is contradictory in its outcome, because when people are detained for more than 3 days before their trial, they're more likely to lose their job. If they lose their income, they can't pay their car bill. They lose their transportation. They get evicted from their home. It could be social services takes their child away from them. All of these negative waterfall of events occur when you lock somebody up. And so, yes, when the public safety demands it, I do believe in preventative detention. There needs to be a hearing held specifically to that person. Do they pose a risk to society? And if they do, they should be detained. But we have these willy-nilly policies that are just based off of charts, based on what is the charge you faced and what other arrests have you ever had. And if so, then your bail is $1,500. Well, there are a lot of people who simply do not have $1,500 in cash and can't pay that. And so they end up stuck in jail for days or weeks before they ever have their trial date. And all that does is make our community less safe.
Representative Szoka, where did your committee come out on cash bail? Was that one of the topics that you took up or looked at?
Well, we briefly discussed it, but as I mentioned before, we didn't have the opportunity to have more than the 5 or 6 meetings that we did. And our recommendations were that it was one of the things we didn't discuss in depth, but that we recommended that it should be looked at in depth because, as has been very well laid out by both Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein, there are issues with it, serious issues that need to be explored, and we need to come to some type of resolution on these things. And that's where we left it.
What about the decriminalization of marijuana? That was not one of your recommendations. Is that something you looked at or have thought about?
Well, and that fell into the similar bucket, which I just described, that we briefly described not only decriminalization of marijuana, but many of the lower misdemeanors of public urination. Should that be a misdemeanor or should it be an infraction? And again, our committee did not have the time to delve into that deeply. I think that the consensus, although we didn't vote on it, but the consensus that I heard from virtually everyone in the committee was that that's a topic for a longer, more in-depth study. to address the issues that, again, Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein have just laid out very well. So we didn't have a conclusion on that, but my personal conclusion is that, again, is something that needs to be studied, and we need to make some changes in that.
Leslie, just on marijuana, because it is a complicated issue, and there are a series of questions that issue begs. One is this question of decriminalization, and a lot of people don't really focus on the difference between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization is where you say this is still against the law, but we're not going to make it a criminal law. It'll be a civil infraction, just like Representative Szoka referenced, so that if you are smoking marijuana, you could get a ticket for some amount. And the reason why we were comfortable going there was because other than traffic offenses, marijuana possession, simple possession, like a half an ounce, and paraphernalia, those two charges result in something like 60,000 arrests a year that just fill up our court system and burden people with criminal records in a way that I think is just unnecessary. The next question about legalization really is very complicated. What rules do you put around growing marijuana? What rules do you put around purchasing? How do you sell it? Is it through a controlled system like the ABC system? Or is it willy-nilly on any street corner? Do you allow marketing? Do you set limits on the THC content? There are just a lot of really complex questions. And so we did what Representative Szoka's committee did on those really tough issues. We punted those, encouraging there to be another group of people with public health, public safety, and racial equity to really study those issues and make a recommendation to the legislature and the public. But we felt very comfortable at this point that as it relates to marijuana possession and paraphernalia possession, let's decriminalize those. Let's stop creating criminals. Once you give somebody a record, it becomes that much harder to get a job and to find a place to live. And then once that happens, the more opportunities you limit people in this lifetime, the easier it becomes to make the wrong decision down the road. And we don't want that. It's not in that person's interest, but it's certainly not in our societal interest either. And so we want those laws to be changed so that they're not crimes. And we want to expunge people whose records are criminally burdened by these prior arrests in the past.
We have two questions, both about local action, both from people who are saying, if I care about these issues, what can I do locally? Representative Szoka, what are you hearing from your constituents about which of these issues there is very strong support for or very strong feelings about? Realizing most of your recommendations are focused on legislative action, I'm just wondering what you're hearing from your constituents.
It's the mixed bag, to be quite honest with you. People who care a lot about issues are those who vocalize them, and they tend to focus around the marijuana issues. They tend to, I can't think of a single person who has contacted me or that I've spoken to that isn't concerned about the George Floyd type incident, excessive use of force. And many people are also concerned about the effects of deadly force, not only on who's on the receiving end of it, but also on the mental effects on the law enforcement officer. I've seen a large outpouring really of concern about our law enforcement officers due to the stress of their jobs being adequately cared for. In mental health routine exams or the whole mental health issue with law enforcement officers. And nobody's saying that they have issues, but if they do, how available is it? Sometimes it goes against the stigma, like in the military. If you have a mental health issue and it becomes widely known, all of a sudden you're kind of toxic to everybody else in your unit. So it's another one of those things where we have to be able to provide mental health treatment to those people who need it, law enforcement officers, without the stigma of having it. So those are the kind of things that I've been hearing from the general public. Now, it's been a little hard to have town meetings during the time of COVID. So most of the input comes to me either by people I've run into in the grocery store, by emails, or a number of phone calls. I wish that I'd be able to do more in-person town halls. Frankly, I'm sick to death of Zoom. It limits communication. I mean, for example, right now, if we're in a group of 500 people, I could tell by looking out into the audience what my words are having, what effect are they having. People either singing with crossed arms or shaking their heads side to side or up and down or whatever. And that doesn't make me change my words, but it does help me knowing who's in the audience. It helps me understand where the feeling of the general public is. So I look forward to when all the COVID restrictions are gone and we can have town hall meetings back in my district to delve into this and other issues of public concern.
General Stein and Justice Earls, you had some open meetings where you heard from people. I'm wondering what your advice to people now that your task force has issued its first set of recommendations. What are your recommendations for people who feel strongly about these ideas? What can they do locally?
Well, the public was really helpful, instrumental, really, in our work in developing the recommendations. We had a series, I think 3, Justice Earls, where people from across the state could sign up anywhere. This was actually, Representative Szoka, where Zoom was a really good thing because it made it so accessible for people. We had one woman who called us from her cell phone from the parking lot of the Correctional Institute in Lumberton. And she was there and she was able to speak to us for 2 minutes and use her slot rather than having to drive to Raleigh. And so it was really quite eye-opening. Then we had a series of regional discussions. I think we did 6 of those across the state. And so we heard and learned a lot from people. Folks really are motivated. They are concerned about the injustices of our justice system and desperately want it to work better for all people. And there are things they can do. A lot of our recommendations, just take marijuana decriminalization. I'm not optimistic, frankly, that the legislature is going to act on that this session. I hope that they do. We wish they would, but I don't think they will. But there's nothing that stops a local police department from de-emphasizing those kinds of arrests. And there's nothing that stops a local prosecutor from de-emphasizing those prosecutions. And so if marijuana policy is important to you, get meetings with your local law enforcement, get meetings with your local district attorney, and engage them on those issues and challenge them and say, how do you handle these cases? Why do you handle them this way? Is this really in the interest of public safety? Could you use your resources, which are limited, differently in a way that would enhance public safety in a greater fashion? So there are ways that you can work with local law enforcement, local prosecutors. Justice Earls talked about really important nonprofit organizations, whether they're reentry programs. If you're a Chamber of Commerce type, get your local town Chamber of Commerce to talk to the local reentry council and encourage all the companies to look at their employment policies. It will shock people if they look at their employment policies, they just blanket kick out for consideration somebody with a criminal record, when there are some people with certain criminal backgrounds who should not be hired. You know, if somebody has a history of financial crimes, you shouldn't hire them as an accountant. If somebody has a history of sexual crimes, they shouldn't be hired at a summer camp. I mean, there's some basic, simple, clear. But if somebody has a marijuana possession from 10 years ago and they want to be a factory worker, you know, why have a rule that just keeps them out without due consideration of their talent and ability? And so those are the kinds of conversations that can happen at the local level, and we genuinely hope that they do.
Justice Earls, talk about expungement a little bit and what can be expunged currently and what you looked at when it came to expungement of past records for people, as General Stein was just referring to.
Right. So that is an area where the law has been expanding to allow greater numbers of people to So expungement means that you have a conviction, but it's for an offense that is eligible to be removed from your record, and the rules can be pretty complex about how many offenses you might have, when you can have an expunction or not, and so it's actually a pretty complicated determination as to whether or not someone is eligible for an expunction. There's a different avenue called a certificate of relief. If you're not eligible for an expunction, if you have too many convictions or the wrong offense, you can still prove that you are now of good character. I believe I'm right that it's 5 years, but after a certain period of time after your conviction, if you've had no other convictions, you can get what's called a certificate of relief, and it basically says you've been of good character, and it also, for employers, if employers hire someone, employers have a concern that if they hire someone with a criminal conviction and then that person commits some kind of crime in the workplace that injures someone else, the employer might be liable. The certificate of relief removes that as a concern for employers. So the goal is to make folks more employable. But again, not everyone is entitled to a certificate of relief. And so there are clinics across the state that have helped people assess whether or not they are eligible for expunctions. And they're run by various entities. Some are more, some DA's offices have helped sponsor these clinics. And there's just so many people who need these services. And the other thing, though, to keep in mind is that when I was at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, we had expunction clinics, and only about half the people who came to our clinics were actually eligible for relief. But we had attorneys available to help them. There continue to be volunteer attorneys assisting. In the Triangle area, Campbell Law School runs a clinic with 12 law students who help people assess whether or not they're eligible for expunctions. So it's a mix of programs depending on where you are in the state. But the goal is to be for people to be able to get rid of some of the barriers. It's not only employment, but housing, educational opportunities. There are just a wide range of ways in which that single conviction can bar you from the basic obtaining the basic necessities of life, and particularly when someone has demonstrated they've served their time and they've been of good character since then, an expunction helps them move forward. One of our recommendations was that we create a process so that if you have convictions in multiple counties, you can just go one time for a certificate of relief. You don't have to go to each single county, because that's been a barrier. And there's also been some examination of whether certain offenses, certain very low-level offenses, could automatically be expunged after a certain period of time. In addition, the court system is adopting an e-court system that will allow people to access our courts online for simple things, or I should say less complex things like divorces or landlord-tenant matters. That's coming online fairly soon. And there's, I think, an effort to see if expunctions and certificates of relief can also be incorporated into an online process so that people can determine their eligibility and get relief more easily.
Follow-up question on certificates of relief. Can you say a little bit more about that? This is from one of our viewers.
So again, I don't. It actually gets kind of complex who is eligible and when. But the basic concept is, if you have been of good character for a certain period of time after your conviction, then you go to court. It's a civil process, but you then have a certificate. You essentially you get a piece of paper that says you have been of good character, and you can use that when you are seeking employment, when you're trying to get an apartment, any place where someone asks about a prior conviction. It doesn't erase the conviction. You still have to acknowledge that you have a conviction, but you have demonstrated that you are of good character.
And I want to compliment the legislature, Representative Szoka and others. They passed a law last year to make the expunction process available to more people. And there are already bills that have been introduced by Republicans and Democrats in this new session that will continue to do it. And I kind of understand the way the legislature's approached it. They take a step sort of every term to make it open to more and more people. And it's just a way for folks to be comfortable with the concept. But really, the challenges facing people post-arrest, post-incarceration are real. And we really want every person to live their life to the fullest, to achieve their potential, to do whatever it is that makes them happy, because in their doing so, they're not only bringing joy to themselves, they're adding value to the community. And everything we can do to make it so that more people can have that kind of life, it's a good thing.
There's a comment in the chat about the overburdening of the court system and the number of cases flowing in, and General Stein talked about that a little bit. One of the things we haven't talked about that was highlighted in Representative Szoka's report was the increase in the use, or the recommendation for an increase in the use of specialty courts. Representative Szoka, could you talk about why that is important and how that might relieve some of the clog that we have in the court system?
Well, I can talk about it a little bit. I think the other two participants may be more expert in talking about how much it might relieve the clog. But just in Cumberland County, home to Fort Bragg, we've had a military court that has looked at military veterans who've had issues and tried to take them off the wrong path and put them back on the right path. It's had, in my opinion, a lot of success. Different areas of states have drugs courts that do the same thing with younger offenders, first or second offense on drugs, trying to get them off the path that Attorney General Stein was alluding to earlier. You don't want to put somebody in jail where they really learn how to be a career criminal. They've done something wrong. Let's get them to modify their behavior and get back on the right path to being a well-rounded, productive citizen. So there's a number of these different kind of courts that specialize in different categories of people that have proven, in my opinion, to be successful. Like anything else in state government, it takes money to keep those programs going and to expand those programs. And there's as I often tell people, to understand the legislature, you have to know how to do sixth grade math. Which sixth grade is where they teach you about percentages. So you have to get 50% plus one, which they teach in kindergarten, plus one in the House, and then in the Senate, or vice versa. Then you have to get 100% of the executive mansion, whoever's sitting there, Republican or Democrat, to agree. So sometimes these things, while they might appear to be no-brainers, there's a wide variety of opinion on what actually is a no-brainer here. And I found in my time, there is no true no-brainer. We have to convince 50% plus one plus the governor that an idea is good. Sometimes that slows things down, as Attorney General Stein was referring to about expunctions. And part of that is, I agree with him, for people who are uncomfortable with a certain course of action to take the first step to see what it looks like, and then they become more willing to take bigger and more progressive steps down the road. And sometimes, myself, I'm not an attorney. A lot of these legal issues are new to me, so there's an education part of this, which is where the public becomes so important in whether it's energy or finance or legal issues. People in the public need to be involved with their House members and with their senators and help educate them on those things that are important to the citizens, and which the citizen might have some expertise that the legislator doesn't. I've learned so much more from people calling me about different issues than by any self-study or anything else. So it's kind of a little wandering answer there, but hopefully it added to the conversation.
Thank you.
On the specialty courts, Leslie, I think they really have promise. If you look at our criminal justice system, a lot of it is simply a catchment system of failures in other parts of our country. If you ask any sheriff who's in their jail, if you ask the Department of Public Safety who's in our prisons, they'll tell you about 70 to 80% of men either have substance use disorder or a mental health problem. And of the women, it's more closer to 100% have either a mental health or substance use issue. If we had a functioning healthcare system that actually treated people's underlying diseases, we could alleviate a lot of crime. And what specialty courts do, the Veterans Court that Representative Szoka referenced in Cumberland, is a lot of the people, the soldiers, they have PTSD, they have substance use issues, and it gets them into criminal behavior. What they've done is wrong. So that needs to have some consequence. But if what we can do is treat the underlying condition that drove them to the bad behavior, we can stop future violations and help that person get on the right path. I was talking to a Superior Court judge in Burke County who desperately wants to have a treatment court, a drug treatment court, because so many of the people that come before him every day have some kind of addiction, often opioids, sometimes meth. And he's like, here's my problem. I have nowhere to refer those people to get the treatment they need because we don't have quality treatment facilities available equitably across the state. There's real disparities between the urban and rural areas. And you can't expect a treatment facility to open up in Burke County and take referrals from a judge to treat somebody with addiction if they can't get paid for that service. This is America. We live in a market economy. People need to get paid to do work. And we are one of a dozen states that have rejected the federal government's offer to expand Medicaid. If we care about mental health, if we care about substance use disorder, if we care about crime, by accepting the federal government's Medicaid expansion offer, then people would have a way to pay for that health care, and we would have much more treatment options available across the state to help people and help us.
Right. I'm guessing that we are not going to get universal agreement to change that on this particular program on this particular day, but that conversation continues. Let me just close with Justice Earls. You're a jurist. You're accustomed to weighing matters. Could you maybe speak for these other two and summarize why you think this matter is so important and what needs to happen over the next couple of years to really improve our systems?
Well, I will speak for myself, but let me tell everyone, first of all, that our task force is still taking public comment. So you'll see the website come up, and that is where you can go to both either submit written comments to us. We also hear from the public at the last 5 minutes or so of every meeting. So when we have our public meetings, there's a chance to address the task force directly then. I think it's clear that the criminal justice system impacts our communities in so many ways, not only because what happens to an individual impacts their family, which then impacts their neighbors, which then impacts their community. It impacts the labor market and what pool of labor businesses have access to the extent that our courts are dealing with criminal matters. They're not dealing with all the civil matters that people want heard. So if you want a divorce or you need to evict someone, the fact that we have, as you mentioned, the overburden of courts. So whether or not you personally or your family is involved in the criminal justice system, the fact of the system and how it operates impacts all of us. And fundamentally, it goes to the question of, particularly the issue of racial equity in our criminal justice system, goes to the question of our fairness and the extent to which we provide justice. And that is just very basic to society. So I really applaud all of the listeners for tuning in this morning, and applaud you for having us and for letting us look at these issues.
Yeah, let me close there. That's our show for today. Our guests have been Associate Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls, Attorney General Josh Stein, and Representative John Szoka. First and Future is produced by James Herrick, with the concept by IEI Communications Director Greg Hedgepath, promotion by Kirsten Chang, research today by Simone Coleman. Renee Potts helps us book our guests and does our slides. Thanks to everybody for joining us. If you like the show, let us know your thoughts or tell a friend. We'll be back on March 30th at 9 a.m. for our next episode. See you in the future.